still a very clear association with fire, and the summon's legacy was retained. The next chronological appearance of Ifrit came in Final Fantasy XI. Acting as the first MMO in the franchise, Final Fantasy XI saw numerous details fleshed out in comparison to what had been seen with previous iterations, and in this regard, summons saw massive benefit. Instead of being pawns who were mere gameplay devices, summons were now integrated into the story, and Ifrit was one of the 6 sleeping gods who resided in proto-crystals that were scattered throughout Vana'diel. This piece of narrative exposition saw Ifrit related to Ramuh and Shiva once again, something that had not happened since Final Fantasy VI, and it was through these proto-crystals that the power of the elemental gods housed within could be harnessed, but not without fighting first. In the case of Ifrit, Ifrit Prime would need to be defeated as part of the Trial by Fire questline, and upon doing so, summoners would gain access to a powerful ally. And that was because, unlike almost every prior iteration, Ifrit wasn't just part of the proverbial furniture. Instead, it was one of the strongest summons available, capable of dealing massive amounts of damage, especially to enemies who are weak against fire. To assist with this damage dealing, this version of Ifrit had the most expansive list of moves to date, but in an interesting twist, Hellfire was not one of them. Instead, this iteration of Ifrit made reference to Inferno, a move previously only seen in Final Fantasy III, if we're chalking the appearance in Final Fantasy VI up to a mistranslation, and Meteor Strike, which had been introduced in Final Fantasy X and was now Ifrit's strongest move. The other moves were a rather rudimentary punch, some high-level fire spells, and 2 new additions called Burning Strike and Flaming Crush. Due to the nature of the experience, some of these moves only affected a single target, but much like in Final Fantasy Tactics, the more expansive moves would only target an area as opposed to guaranteeing damage to entire enemies. What was also intriguing about this iteration of Ifrit was the design. Its body was brown at its core, but also had black horns, but layered over the top were fiery red scales acting as a type of armor. All of these traits, alongside the addition of the ability to fight against Ifrit as either a group or solo via trial-sized Trial by Fire, made this particular iteration quite comprehensive. But what followed afterwards was a period of experimentation for Ifrit, as appearances deviated from what had been established or just served as subtle odes. It would have been easy for Ifrit's appearance in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance to serve as a continuation to what had been seen in Tactics. And in many regards, it was. But from a visual perspective, the developers chose to add something of a flourish. Ifrit still featured a brown body and brown hair, and its appearance as a horned beast was retained. Ifrit was adorned with a full coat of golden armor and had hooves complete with wooden legs. Unlike every prior game, in Tactics Advance, Ifrit could be summoned upon equipping a weapon, and in this case it was the Guard Staff. Once enough AP had been accumulated, Ifrit would then be mastered, and could be summoned without equipping the staff, even when using another role. Nonetheless, Ifrit was of decent strength, and was mid-tier in terms of performance, something that had not been the case since Final Fantasy IV. This particular iteration of Ifrit was then carried through to many of the properties that spawned from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, including Final Fantasy Tactics A2, the Crystal Defenders, and Final Fantasy Tactics S. But when it came to the release of Final Fantasy XII, even though it was also part of Evilisian lore, Ifrit did not appear, at least in the traditional sense. This represented a first, as up until this point in the franchise, even though there had been a few exceptions, such as Mystic Quest and earlier iterations of the Saga and Mana franchises, after Final Fantasy III, Ifrit appeared in every single Final Fantasy release, and had done so as a summoned beast. Final Fantasy XII broke this tradition by relegating the traditional Final Fantasy summons to references, and in this regard, Ifrit appeared alongside Shiva and Leviathan as airships that were part of the 8th Fleet. It would have been assumed, based on there being no Ifrit present in Final Fantasy XII, that its sequel would follow suit, but Ifrit appeared in Revenant Wings amongst an abundance of Espers. But even though Ifrit had appeared in numerous EVS games prior to Revenant Wings, there was no reference to what had come before. Ifrit was now covered in crimson red fur, and had already come with the Yeti, and the feral beast we'd come to expect. This iteration was also unique, as it represented the first appearance of a black body and white horns. Ifrit could be bought using the new Auracite system, and it was classified as a rank 3 fire-type melee summon. This made Ifrit a high-skill Esper that could cause significant damage with use of Burning Strike, and we've previously only seen in Final Fantasy XI, and its special attack, Hellfire. There was also a nice bonus added here, as even though Hellfire was an area of effect move, it also affected targets with slow. Throughout the game, Ifrit could also be fought multiple times as a boss, a nice reference back to Final Fantasy X, where opposition did not defend a victory in a skirmish. Ifrit also had its first official connection with the Jinn, if we're talking up Final Fantasy IV as an error, as Jinn appeared as a weaker variant of the Fire-type summon when they fought alongside Ifrit in numerous missions. Ifrit next appeared in Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. This was an interesting iteration, because even though before Crisis had taken direct inspiration from what had appeared in Final Fantasy VII, the development team working on Crisis Core saw fit to ignore what had come before and create a brand new Ifrit. It saw the mustard-coloured body replaced with a standard brown body and fiery hair instead of purple hair. This Ifrit also had a pronounced pop, as seen in Final Fantasy IX, and to coincide with it, we saw things return to the type of design. This was also visible as in Final Fantasy X, but to take it one step further, this particular Ifrit featured small pieces of armor and shoulders. Throughout Crisis Core, Ifrit was also the first encounter came in Test Genesis, and the second came by a mission called Rematch with Ifrit. And it was on completion of this second mission that Ifrit would be made available, and when summoned, Ifrit would use Hellfire, the MW attack, but its power was dependent on the level of it. Being fought against, Ifrit could also use a second flamethrower, representing an interesting twist, as the notion of the Jinn creating a terrible impact on Ifrit is not so bad. Even though they were established in the original version of the remake, they were Ifrit now featured a fiery body, complete with accompanying horns and hair. We had only ever seen this before in Final Fantasy Unlimited, and I'd like to think that in some small way the developers were inspired by the anime. Everything else was a direct reference to the original. Ifrit was auto-learned and mandatory, and when called upon would perform Hellfire, a strong move that classified Ifrit as a mid-tier summon. Final Fantasy IV The After Years then made reference to Ifrit from both the original SNES version of Final Fantasy IV and the DS version, depending on which version you chose to play. Every other trait was kept intact, but there were some slight tweaks made. Ifrit could now only be acquired after being bested in combat, and it also appeared as an unbeatable boss in the context of the story, and in this regard, it also meant that you could fight Ifrit multiple times. Ifrit next surfaced in Dissidia Final Fantasy, a game that pulled from various sources to celebrate the franchise. It saw the past of Ifrit celebrated too, with Final Fantasy IV Ifrit being called upon when doing a manual summon, and Final Fantasy X Ifrit called upon when doing an automatic summon. It was then meant to stay in its sequel, Duodisa, but owing to the inclusion of Yuna, Ifrit from Final Fantasy X also made an appearance, and it could make use of Meteor Strike and Hellfire, just like in the original game. For the next numbered Final Fantasy, Ifrit was again kept on the sidelines, as Final Fantasy XIII only featured a loose reference. Ifrit appeared during the Promptus Sancta event, where it served as an eidolon of the Pulsar Sea that was attempting to destroy the Queen. As part of this story, Ifrit squared off against Ramuh, who was representing a Kakuna Sea, and this served as a nice ode to previous games where the pair had a connection. From a visual perspective, it was similar to what had been seen within Final Fantasy VIII and X, with brown body and fiery hair, but the horns were now metallic, with fire literally coming out of the top. Ifrit's next appearance also served as a nice ode, but it was a much more comprehensive one, as the team who worked on Final Fantasy mentioned had previously worked on the After Years. It meant Ifrit had a similar visual design, although its body was made brown this time. Ifrit would need to be forged and defeated in a cave of Alphabidity in order to be acquired. During this fight, and when used as a summon after, Ifrit would make use of Hellfire, which displayed in standard application. But Ifrit also had a new move in the boss battle. It was called Heat Up, and made Ifrit stronger and faster, and allowed it to use Hellfire. The next major iteration of Ifrit came in Final Fantasy XIV. and just like the previous MMO, Ifrit was again ingrained into the game's lore. This time, Ifrit and Prime were worshipped by the Amaljar beast tribe, and they planned to use its savagery to defend themselves against the Garlean Empire. As part of this process, the tribe would kidnap individuals so that they could be tempered by Ifrit and turned into worshippers. Owing to their fanaticism, they attempted to summon Ifrit multiple times, but it was defeated each and every time. Perhaps because of its association with the Amaljar, Ifrit was given a more Ifrit appearance in this particular game and adopted the fiery colour scheme, similar to what had been seen within the Final Fantasy IV remake, but with much more detail. Ifrit could be fought various times in the Bowl of Embers, and with each increasing difficulty, the breadth of action taken by Ifrit was increased. Amongst these selections were numerous odes back to Final Fantasy XI, such as Inferno, Meteor Strike, Burning Strike, and Flaming Crush. This iteration also introduced plenty of new moves such as Eruption, Crimson Cyclone, Incinerate, and Infernal Nails, which was particularly harsh if the summoned nail was not destroyed. Some of these moves could then be used when summoning Ifrit to aid in battle, but even though Hellfire was used by Ifrit when appearing as an antagonist, this particular move was not used under instructions from the player. Inferno was instead installed as its most powerful move. Nonetheless, when looking at all of the elements combined, alongside Final Fantasy X and XI, this was one of the most comprehensive iterations of Ifrit to date. Final Fantasy Type 0 continued a common trend, as even though there was no chronological association with Crisis Core, the two games were worked on by the same team, and the model used in both games was near identical, perhaps to speed up production. That was where the similarities stopped, as this particular iteration of Ifrit was one of, if not the most expansive we had ever seen in the franchise. Within the context of the game's story, Ifrit was associated with the Dominion of Rubrum, and was often used to help repel invasions from rival factions. But what made this particular iteration of Ifrit so comprehensive was that Ifrit was no longer a singular entity. Instead, Ifrit was a class of Eidolon, and each variant of Ifrit had a different name, as well as different abilities. The most common moves were Eruption, which had just been introduced in Final Fantasy XIV, Meteor Strike, and a new move called Blazing Strike. This was used by Ifrit, Firebrand, Rubicon, and Voltron, but Calamity was quite different, as due to its specialism and its base skill with all the variants, it could only use a move called Blazing Fist. This variant was then opposite, unable to fight both range, devastating long range due to the use of Meteor Hit, upgrade of Meteor Strike, and Hellfire. Each of these summons is given to the player, completing a specific objective and switching to its versus individual, and they all have strengths and weaknesses, such as innate regen, longer summon time, and berserk status. But even though there were so many different variants, no version of Ifrit was ever fought, a very uncommon occurrence. Final Fantasy Explorers arrived a few years later, and Ifrit was one of the 12 summons available for players to call upon. Also known as the Fire Djinn, Ifrit could be fought as a boss 2 times and could be used by the player if encased in Magicite. Across the various fights, and when summoned, Ifrit had access to Hellfire, but also used Flaming Fist, which had just been introduced in Type 0, and 2 new moves, Fiery Advance and Conflagrant Wall. Ifrit also built upon the visual design of Final Fantasy 8 and 10, returning to a beast-like appearance with brown body and fiery hair, but with much more in the way of armor plating. This iteration of Ifrit was then repurposed for Final Fantasy Explorers 4, but a similar approach was not adopted for the follow-up to Final Fantasy Dimensions. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 arrived a few years after the original game, and although there were some similarities, it was very much its own experience. Due to creative liberties afforded to the development staff, this saw Ifrit take on a rather different form, as instead of being a horned beast, Ifrit was a horned humanoid with white hair and a fiery beard. In this form, Ifrit appeared as a story boss inside the Ifritia mines, but also appeared during boss-specific events. And when fought and summoned, Ifrit would use Hellfire and other standard fire spells. Dimensions 2 also various Dark Ifrit, 4, there was also Mirror Ifrit and God Ifrit, which was more traditional in appearance, albeit with very more force. These had their quirks, and used to use some traits. Dark Ifrit, for example, used a new move called Triple Hellfire. This dealt fire damage to all enemies, but instead of it being just a single attack, it dealt damage 3 times. Mobius continued to develop challenging the established norms of Ifrit, but it also offered balance and making reference to past performance. As Mobius was developed by some of the people who worked on Final Fantasy X, they chose to have this particular iteration of Ifrit return to help the Warrior of Light, but it also appeared as a boss who could be fought against multiple times, and even had a collaboration event with Shiva. When fought, Ifrit used Meteor Strike and Hellfire just like the original game. It could also use Eruption and a brand new move called Backdraft. It was also possible to summon the Final Fantasy VII version of Ifrit, and this is intriguing, as instead of being a fire elemental, the card was associated with the light element. Mobius also introduced some more unique traits in Ifrit. The standard version of Ifrit was still but the design saw the first appearance of a metallic body and featured hair that looked more like tentacles. Extreme Ifrit then built upon the Final Fantasy X model but changed the body colour to black, and Extreme Ifrit X built upon it further, exaggerating more with the Ifrit. We also saw the first but instead of being a horned beast, the Ifrit was a horned humanoid, much like we had just seen in Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. After all of this change, the developers of Exvius decided to keep things a bit more traditional. Ifrit adopted the fiery appearance seen in Final Fantasy IV Remake 2013, adding its own unique spin by giving Ifrit a bit more armor alongside the wrist guards. And after being found in the Infernal Hollow, Ifrit could be acquired after being bested in combat. Due to being acquired so early, Ifrit was one of the weakest escorts available to use, but still provided utility against fiery enemies, especially when using its ultimate move, Hellfire. Ifrit next appeared in Final Fantasy VII Arcade with T as one of the summons that players could use to try and solve the in battle. Unlike the two previous Dissidia games, which called upon established versions of Ifrit, Dissidia Arcade featured an original take on the venerable summon and would pull back some long-forgotten traits. It saw Ifrit sport a mustard-coloured body, something that has not happened since Final Fantasy VII, and brown hair, another trait that has fallen by the wayside in favour of fiery hair, though Ifrit did still have fiery hair on its wrists. Called upon, Ifrit would be able to damage the opposition team by using Meteor Strike and its ultimate move was against Hellfire, but when fought against, Ifrit could use it to break the wall, proof that it only left used before Final Fantasy Sports. This version of Ifrit is similar to what was established in Final Fantasy X, and if it was given much of the story, powerful mirages able to guide Ren and Mars on the quest. After jumping through enough hoops, Ifrit can be a child of the Mars, and in combat, various fire-based moves are seen, including Hellfire. Numerous variants of Ifrit also featured, with Ifrita appearing as another female iteration. The EX dungeon also introduced a black and white variant family, with Gleefrit appearing as the most evolved form. But if we're talking about strong appearances of Ifrit, then Final Fantasy XV needs to take center stage, as the summon saw its role in Final Fantasy meta evolved.
Stay cool. He's gonna bring the heat.
Even though not required numerous summons, Ifrit was not one of them. Back on the other asteroids in the card, Ifrit ended up as their enemy, with a source of iron off the land causing subsequent targets, and subsequently used as a mission to come to the zombies, before then being asked to fill the same role, not the Because of this change, the decision was taken as a capacity of appearance in favour of the humanoid, and had started with the trait. We saw Ifrit's main people associated with fire, as his body was pale and his horns were the bones. It still has brown hair, however. In the context of the game, Ifrit was brought against the Fragmentary, and outside of the Gamma attack, he used the help, which had not been seen. This could have perhaps been a translation of Episode as ardent and comrades. The most recent iteration of Ifrit has been seen within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it appeared as one of the summons available to players after being gifted by Jesse, as well as a boss in the Shinra Combat Simulator. Due to its source, this version of Ifrit had a lot of similarities with what had been seen within the original Final Fantasy VII. So it featured a mustard-coloured body, brown horns and purple hair, but it was also given fiery hair and wrist guards, something that did not feature as part of the original design, but had been adopted in Crisis Core. Even though Ifrit was low tier in the original game, owing to the nature of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it was upgraded to being one of the strongest summons available, and the Autobahn could use Hellfire as its ultimate move, but it could also use two other moves, Radiant Plume, previously seen in Final Fantasy XIV, and Crimson Dive. And that plants us at an interesting place as we look forward to Final Fantasy XVI. We don't know all that much at the moment, but we do know that Ifrit will have a prominent role within the story and could well have a connection with Phoenix. We also know that from a visual perspective, it's somewhat iterating on what we saw in Final Fantasy XIV, as even though the lizard-like appearance isn't there, it's all about the fire. As we learn more throughout 2021, many established traits and choose to incorporate into this unique division of Ifrit. Well, with that, we look at the second Final Fantasy XVI. We are at the end of this evolutionary topic, and we hope you have enjoyed this retrospective view of how Ifrit appeared as such a integral role throughout the Final Fantasy franchise. Unlike our previous evolution videos, we adopted a different approach this time around, as we looked at the evolution from a logical perspective, which opens up pretty much everything how big or small. We hope you got to enjoy this video, and it would be great to hear what you thought. And if you enjoyed it, please feel free to share it below. We'd also love to hear what some of you guys want to happen next, so be sure to let us know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe as well, as outside of publishing more evolutionary topics, we are also looking to deliver our first documentary style video within the next month. It will focus on the complete history of Square, and we are so excited to share it with you. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our patrons and YouTube members, especially Rainy Nathan, Logan Nico and Benjamin Snow, who are super special on-the-email supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone watching this video. We'll see you again soon. Final Fantasy. When thinking about the vast array of jobs and classes associated with the fantasy role from one, it's easy to get one and by that, only monks and magicians. These two classifications of warrior have been romanticized for as long as stories have been told, with prominent examples seen throughout mythological tales passed down through the centuries and in more recent works of fiction. Due to the prominence of these two archetypes, it's often easy to forget that many others have existed, and one of the more intriguing is the thief, or the rogue. Not quite as glamorous as the guttural knight or the brazen mage, thieves have often taken the back seat, skulking around due to their perceived cowardice. But it's those distinctive traits that transitioned so well to the realm of role-playing games, as they allow players to live to fight another day, all while pilfering spoils to improve the party's odds of success throughout the campaign. And it's those distinctive traits that we're going to run through today, as we hope to take you on an expansive journey that explores the path thieves have taken throughout the Final Fantasy franchise following their introduction back in 1987. It's well documented that the original Final Fantasy used Dungeons & Dragons as a source of inspiration, as Akitoshi Kawazu had become obsessed with tabletop gaming and early role-playing games like Ultima. Based on this, the appearance of a thief in Final Fantasy was unsurprising, as it had been introduced within the Greyhawk supplemental in 1975, upgraded to being a standard character class within the original player's handbook. Here, we got to see an array of abilities introduced, including the ability to open locks, remove traps, pick pockets, strike silently from behind, and move with a high degree of stealth. They could also understand treasure maps, allowing them to find treasures that their contemporaries could not.